Welcome back to the Renaissance Space podcast, where we have the opportunity to listen and better understand life in education. I'm delighted to be speaking to Jacqui Rose, who last year with Anderson Press published her book Birdie. When Birdie is sent to live with her great aunt in the 1950s, she faces racial discrimination and bullying. The pit pony is key, as is depicted on the front cover. Good morning, Jacqui. Just so lovely to see you and hear you.
Hi, how are you, Margaret? I'm very excited to do this podcast. Thank you for asking me.
Not at all. Absolute pleasure. So before we get into the book and books and you as a writer, would you like to just share a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Well, I'm a proud Northerner. I'm an author of colour, which I'm also very proud of. And I was brought up in Yorkshire, but I was adopted. And that is relevant because it was the way I saw the world growing up, and it's relevant to the reasons later on when we discuss Birdie. So the adoption had a profound effect on me. And I loved reading when I was younger because it was my safe space, because I struggled making friends. So the magic of reading and actually the magic of writing has always been with me.
Oh, wow. How lovely. I've got some grandchildren, and one of my grandchildren recently said, reading takes me into worlds that I couldn't go to. And I just thought, and you're saying such a similar thing, but obviously in more adult language. And it is escapism, really, isn't it?
Absolutely, because it was a place where I could control, well, to do with the writing, was a place where I could control where I went, who I was, how people saw me. I could explore who I was, my identity, and I could have these fantastic adventures all in a safe space. And then with reading, the same thing. I could be taken away from the stress that I was experiencing. And it was like a treasure trove of just a magic, a flying carpet taking me to fantastic places.
Amazing. Just escaping that fear or that anxiety. What a wonderful image. Really fantastic. Well, we'd love to talk a little bit more about Birdie, and you've already mentioned the title in what we've just been talking about. So perhaps you'd like to expand a little bit on how that came to be and where the nurturings, where the beginnings were.
Yes, I think the beginnings is from my childhood, because in Birdie, she has a very strong relationship with the pit pony. And when I was growing up, I used to see the pit ponies going in and out of the mines, and that had a huge effect on me. It really troubled me. I was really worried about them. So when I was younger, even then I was writing, stories about helping ponies to escape. And then I sort of just went on my life, writing, acting, because I was an actress at first, but it never left me. It never left me, this feeling I had about the pit ponies and how I felt. And just more and more as I got older, the sound of the story I wanted to write became greater in my head. And then I started to hear Birdie speaking to me, and I knew it was a story I had to write. But when it first came to me, I wasn't quite sure how I was going to place it into what vehicle, which was really important to me. So it was sort of bubbling away for many years before I actually sat down and wrote it.
Wow, that's amazing. And what comes across to me here is your incredibly strong empathy core, really. At a very young age, you were already experiencing the real emotion and care for a pony, which is a human, not human, I mean, is a living organism. But the fact that you were already identifying with the way in which that pony or those ponies were wanting to be loved and nurtured, that's so powerful.
Absolutely. I think, apart from writing and reading, animals were also my safe place. And a farmer allowed me to learn to ride his scruffy cob. But to me, he was a king amongst stallions. And when I look back, I do laugh because he was hardly groomed. He had long feathers. He was a mess when you think about it. But I loved him, and he was called Wild Sun. And he touched my heart, and I had that connection that I hadn't had with my peer group. So that stays with you. Again, that had a profound effect on me. So it was all these moments from all these beats from my childhood that came into the mix when I thought I have to sit down and write Birdie.
Wow. I mean, who knew? And Wild Sun. I mean, what a wonderful name. I've got this amazing image of this very sort of almost like a golden retriever equivalent of a horse with lots of feathers and slightly scruffy but lovable and a bit of a character. I've already conjured that up from your description.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, he was amazing. He was amazing. And he was, I probably only rode him for about 3 or 4 years, but he put me on the path to where I am now. And if it hadn't been because of him, maybe I wouldn't have had horses in my life. Maybe I wouldn't have written Birdie. Who knows? It's amazing how these moments do shape your world and the way you see it.
So just talking about writing and the sort of plan and the plot and the way in which you uncover what you want to write. Obviously, those early years nurtured the idea, and maybe initially you weren't aware that that's where it was going to end up. You've also written adult books, haven't you?
Yes, absolutely. Because how I got into writing, because I didn't think somebody like me could write. I thought I had to go to university. I thought I'd be really clever, like my sister. She went to Cambridge, and because reading when I was young, apart from the joy I had when I went to secondary school, it was all these textbooks that I didn't connect to. And that actually put me off reading. And so when I left school, I actually went into acting, but I used to get these scripts and they were very stereotypical, very sort of, oh, here you go. Here's a single mother, mixed race, pregnant with no money on the dole. And I used to get so frustrated with these parts. And so I thought, let me just sort of write my own things. And that's where it started off, my joy of writing again. And I used to put on plays in the community. And then my friend said to me, why don't you write a book? Why don't you write a book, put all these stories you've got down? And I thought, can I do that? And she sort of challenged me. So I sat down and I had no idea what I was doing. But then it's storytelling, isn't it? And that's why I just sat down with no rules and regulations. I didn't worry about the technical aspect of it. And I wrote a book, and I looked in the writer's handbook and I sent it off to an agent. And she phoned me up and said, I love your writing, but nobody will want to read this. But can you write Gangland? Which was a bizarre thing to say when I look back. But I was naive. I felt imposter syndrome. And I thought, well, maybe I can. And that's how I got into writing crime and Gangland, because that's what I went ahead and did. I wrote a book about Gangland.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And I know you and I have talked about Jeffrey Boacci, who we recently spoke to, and he talked about how actually writing for children can appear to be so much easier than writing for an adult audience. And he spoke quite eloquently about the fact that actually it's much more challenging because children need to be lured in and they need to be captured.
Absolutely. Because I went on to write, I think it was 16 or 17 adult books. And whilst I enjoyed it and it built my craft, my heartbeat really was writing for children, because that was the original manuscript that I sent off to my agent. But at the time, even though it was only 12 or 13 years ago, there were so many gatekeepers and it was much less diverse and inclusive than it is now. There's still a long way to go, but then it was much, much harder. But as, the doors started to open, I thought, let me write from my heart, because my adults, they were great, but they paid my bills, but I wanted to write from my heart. And when my adopted mom died, I didn't know where to put my emotions. So I did what I always had done throughout my life. I wrote things down. I started to write because that, again, was my safe space. And from there, The Haunting of Tyrese Walker was born before Birdie. And it was an eye-opener how different it is to write children's, as your question was saying, because there's a huge responsibility to get it right, to make sure it's appropriate, to make sure there's an understanding without writing down to children. You have to have a real connection on the page. Whereas with the adults, sometimes you do just go, you write it down, that's it, one edit, boom, you're done. It wasn't like that at all.
I'm so interested by that. When you're talking and when you're explaining your journey, and your intention was to write for children, you ended up writing for adults, and then you wanted to write Birdie because that has been in your heart for all your life. How do you make sure that the language you're using and the vocabulary that you're using and the sentence length that you're crafting works? Because you can't sit there with a dictionary or a lexicon. Are you conscious that you're conscious of your audience, but are you conscious of your style or the content in the way that you position it?
It's a really interesting question, because after Tyrese was for teenagers. So I still hadn't moved into the middle ground area, middle age area. And so again, I thought I was learning my craft, but it wasn't at all. And I think you have to start with a respect and a connection for children. That's where I started from. And I think it helped because Birdie's voice was so strong. It was so strong in me that it was almost like I was her secretary and just writing down what she said. In a way, that was the easier part of it, because the themes of Birdie do touch on racism and loss and grief and the healing of a whole country because it's post-war. That was the tricky part, to explain what Birdie's going through age appropriately, but making sure there was the thread of hope, but without making it into a Disney all is well. That was a challenge, and I enjoyed the challenge, but I did have to keep stepping back from the page and thinking, how is this coming across? And what I did, I recorded it and then I played it back to myself.
Oh, clever.
Where it sat. I felt slightly away from the text that way. I could judge it more because the dialogue and the connection when Birdie's talking to her friends or when she's talking to the pit pony was me tapping in to, how I was as a child. Birdie was a much braver child than me. So that was easier. And how I saw Yorkshire, again, that was tapping into my life experience. So that was easier. But obviously, I'm not going to put on the page the racism that I experienced, because that's really harsh. It was really dark. It was really difficult. So I had to take that and filter it. And that was really interesting. And my agent was fantastic. Charlie Shepherd was fantastic at Anderson Press. She was great. And we talked about it. But there was a push-pull because obviously I'd had a lived experience. And sometimes people who, I haven't had that lived experience will give a suggestion. And I'm thinking, no, that's not right at all. That just, So we did go back and forth on it because it was important to get it right.
I'm absolutely thrilled to hear you expand on that. Just before I talk about some of the things that have hit me as you've been talking, I don't know if you know, but we have a piece of software called ATOS Analyzer. It's free. So if anybody wants to use it in a similar vein, and I was fascinated to see that Birdie comes out at a 5.1, which for accelerated reader means that children around the sort of top end of primary, beginning of secondary, that's where it is. So that is where our piece of software, which has been around a long time, so we know it's pretty spot on. You must be thrilled to hear that.
I am absolutely thrilled, because you go in there and you don't know how it's going to come across, because I've read, children's books and I think this sounds very adult, or this sounds, much younger than they're trying to hone in on. And so it is spot on. And so I'm delighted that this software agrees, and I agree with the software, because Birdie actually, I went in, and in the book is actually a conscious decision not to name how old she is, because I wanted the reader to connect with her on different levels, because I felt that there's part of Birdie that comes across as quite young, like 10. And then there's a part of Birdie that's an older soul that comes across as much older. But it was always aimed at this sort of 10 to 11 to 12 to, that age group, the core. But I also wanted, caregivers, parents to be able to read to their children, for younger children. And I also wanted older, readers, even adults, to be able to connect with Birdie. But I love your software. Yes.
It's just so lovely to hear, because, I mean, there are some dark themes there, war and racism, loss, all of those elements which children are aware of, but they need to interpret them in their own way and at their own level without us having to expose some of the very not so pleasant aspects. And so we've also put it at a middle years, which means that we're saying, ideally it's 9 to 12. We probably wouldn't recommend children under 9 to read it, but maybe someone could read it to them, because then there can be a little bit of brokering of the language and answering questions. So, I mean, just from a sort of selfish point of view, not that it's down to me, I only work for the company, but I'm just so thrilled that, we've got this amazing match, that you've done such a fantastic job of making sure that people can appreciate your firsthand experience through the lens of a 10-year-old, but actually being able to slot into there the elements that you wanted to bring home.
Absolutely. It was with children's book, I really do think there's got to be hope. With my adult books, some of them, there's no hope whatsoever. And that's okay. That's okay. But for children, especially when you are looking at themes of loss and grief and racism, that to me, there has to be hope. There has to be love. And that's why I brought the pit pony in. There has to be empathy. And when I'm writing for children, for me, it's important not to tell them how they should think. I want them to feel it. I want them to feel Birdie's journey. I want them to feel the experience of connecting with an animal or connecting with what Birdie's going through. And it's down to them how they feel at the end. And that's what is really important for me to do, for the reader to make their decision, how they feel about Birdie and who she is, and how she is with the villagers and the way she communicates and the sort of relationship she has. I mean, I'm hoping that they go away wanting to be Birdie's friend. In fact, I had a adult reader get in touch, and she was in her 60s, and she said, I would have loved to have Birdie as my friend when I was younger.
Oh, how amazing. I also loved how you talk about Birdie and not wanting to give too much away, because you want the children to picture her in their image. They can own the character with the hints and tips and little bits of information you're giving. And it brings up that whole conversation around film and video. And I understand the requirements for films and video, and we all enjoy watching things on television or at the cinema or wherever. But I'm always anxious when children's books are very quickly made into films, because I think it takes something away, because the imagination, I'm not going to be critical of J.K. Rowling, because obviously she's written some amazing books, But I was always a bit saddened that so quickly the films came out, because then I can remember the morning that the first book, Harry Potter book, was offered. I was on playground duty in a school, and there were 100 children sitting around the playground reading the book.
Wow.
And it was such an amazing experience, because the excitement. But as soon as the films started coming out, we've sort of lost something there. So I love the fact that you know that you want children to own your character and to make her who they want her to be. It's just wonderful.
Absolutely. And it was interesting, actually, because the illustrator Keith Robinson is fantastic. And in my head, when I'm writing, whenever I see my characters, I see them, but I don't see their faces completely. It's almost like they're blurred when I really concentrate, because it's the holistic emotional approach that I see them with and connect them with. So the actual features, albeit it was important for this particular book to explain what Birdie looks like, so she could be quote unquote different to her peers with her hair and her, her skin color, that I didn't actually, sort of really see her eyes, really see her nose. I knew what they'd kind of look like, but not specifically. So when I had to brief, and when we briefed Keith Robinson, I was a bit nervous of what he would create, but I think he's absolutely captured the spirit of Birdie down to a T. I caught my breath when I saw it. And it's funny, when I've been going into schools, I show the cover and I ask the children, what do you think of this cover? What, who do you think Birdie is? And straight away they say, I think she's brave. I think she's looking for freedom. I think she's an adventurer. And I love that, because even though Birdie doesn't realize she's all those things, and that comes, because of the adversity she faces during her story, Keith captured her spirit, and I think that's incredible.
I think you're absolutely right. That image of her standing there, you almost feel you can see the open space in front of her, and she can go wherever she wants to go and do whatever she wants to do. And just in the background, there's a sort of hint of the pit pony. It's dominant, but it's not. It's a really lovely rendition of everything you were hoping to capture. So I can see why you're so excited.
Yeah, I was just excited about the pit pony, because it's funny, because there are two themes in it. Because it was like Michael Morpurgo wrote Warhorse, and it was a homage for the horses. I wanted to do the same thing for the pit ponies, and write a homage to the unsung heroes of the coal industry. And so when I'm going into schools, I am actually, it shows my age, but I am actually surprised that they don't know about pit ponies, even though they are, learning about the coal industry. They're like, pit ponies, wow. And they're surprised that they lived in the darkness day in, week in, month after month, year after year, and not coming out into the light. So I'm pleased that I'm, not only able to tell Birdie's story, but the pit pony's story, because their story needed to be told.
Amazing. So having written Birdie, that's obviously a culmination of all sorts of experiences, not least of all your early childhood. What next?
Well, I have written 4 pony book series, pony books, which is set in a boarding school. Again, from my childhood, is free therapy for me, I think, because I went to boarding school. So, and I'm excited about that, because there was a time and a space for it. So it's Mallory Towers meets the Pony Club, but I love the fact that I was able to bring an inclusive cast of characters to it, which was missing very much to the pony books. So I'm very excited about that. And then I'm obviously writing my adult books, which I'm going to start writing Victorian Gothic horror for my adult books. I'm really excited about that. And then with the children's book, I have to wait for my heart to beat. I'm not just writing for the sake of writing. There are sort of things bubbling away, but for me, it's really important that it isn't just because I have to meet a contract, pay a bill for children's books, for myself anyway, because it's much more important for that. So I'm not quite sure what story I'm going to do next, but I'll know when it really, really speaks to me. Then I'll sit down and I'll write it, because for me, it isn't about the money for the children's. And I'm lucky in the sense I have the stream of the adult, books to hold me up. So I can write when I want for the children's books. And that's the joy for me, writing, to write from my heart.
Well, I'm excited for you, actually, Jacqui. I really am. I think it's been such a lovely conversation listening to you explore, even maybe revisit again some of your experiences from your early life, which has obviously had such an impact on the way in which you write. So thank you for sharing so much with us. And thank you for writing Birdie. And thank you for the books that you're going to deliver for us at some point on the bookshelf. Is there anything you'd like to add that we haven't touched on?
No, I'm just delighted. I am absolutely delighted that Birdie is connecting with so many people. I couldn't have wanted or wished for anything more. That Birdie is no longer just a voice in my head. She's her own free spirit.
Well, thank you so much for your honesty, your passion, and your incredible insight. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Wherever your place or space, I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as me. How could you not when somebody shares such a vivid and emotional picture of their life seen through the eyes of a young girl? If you've enjoyed this episode of the Renaissance Space podcast, please take a moment to rate and review us. And don't forget, you can catch up on all previous episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts. Just search for the Renaissance Space podcast. Please do get in touch. If there's anything you'd like to know, podcast@renaissance.com. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of the Renaissance Space podcast, please check out the Education Joining the Dots podcast from our colleagues at GL Assessment. Thank you.